One of the things that I'm just not totally sure how to deal with as a public figure who sometimes does disagree, and agree too with the Holy Father on some core issues is, what is my role, especially as a new Catholic, a Catholic that has some public voice? Like, what should I do when, for example, the Pope issues an order on the Latin Mass that I think is not the right order for the Church? Even though I'm not a big Latin Mass guy, that things like that felt a little bit. It felt wrong, right? I'll not go further than that.
Okay, so this is like, if you can give us a sort of like overview, like what's the last since Protestantism, I guess, all the different attacks on the Latin Mass versus the people trying to protect it.
Well, I mean, this has been another part of the traditional Catholic, body of thought for a long time. And Michael Davies famously wrote Cranmer's Godly Order, for example, drawing parallels between Cranmer's table, the prayer service and stuff that they set up, with Bugnini's reforms and what happened to the Latin Mass. It goes back, obviously, to the Reformation period, but also Protestant, as that is unfolding, then probably the greatest, I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but in my opinion, the greatest pope in the history of Christendom, after Peter, I suppose, you would have to say is Pius V. In my opinion, is St. Pope Pius V. He recognizes the advance of the devil on the liturgy specifically. So what does he do? He codifies the traditional Latin Mass. This is
Protestantism's effect on the liturgy.
Exactly. So he's so concerned about the Protestant Revolt that's happening and the advances that are made against the Church, and again specifically the wars of liturgy, that he codifies it. And he says he actually has a bull, quo primum, which says now and forever, in perpetuity, no one can change this Mass. Don't change this Mass. You cannot change this Latin Mass. Why? Because he knew if they started tinkering with it, if they changed it, if it was the greatest, the strongest, the most powerful bulwark against Protestantism, against heresy in Christendom, he knew it. And so he carves it into stone, if you will, knowing what was coming if anything happened to that Latin Mass. And that's been the case all along. So Modernists come along, and Modernist is just another sort of iteration of the Protestant heresy. Bugnini, Annibale Bugnini, he comes along, he starts tinkering with everything. He wants to tinker with the Rosary that was also codified by Pope Pius V after, during the Council of Trent times. And then, of course, moving forward, even Pius XII, whom we all love very much, even he was influenced by Monsignor Bugnini at the time to start tinkering with the Holy Week liturgies, right? The beginning, the slippery slope. I don't think he ever intended that, but that, of course, is part of the historical record. They've been moving against the Mass. So the same guy who convinced Pope Pius XII to start, maybe making the Holy Weeks a little shorter, the liturgies a little shorter, a little bit more easy. He, later on, is the one who has a huge influence on Pope Paul VI's pontificate, changes the Mass, gives us a new Mass, a Novus Ordo, a new Mass, and was suspect of Freemasonry to such an extent that he's banished by Paul VI himself. It became so obvious, like, oh, wow, this guy is a little bit controversial, he's a hot potato. Paul VI banishes him to Iran or something under suspicion of Freemasonry. You see, and it was over the Mass. He's called the father of the new Mass, and somebody pointed this out. Walter, you pointed this out today. If you don't think the Latin Mass is all that important, okay, fine, let's rethink it then. Think about what's happened since the Mass has been watered down, and so you end up with this Novus Ordo, the new Mass, which now is just off the charts with guitars and felt banners and nothing that was ever called for by Vatican II. But there you have it, this sort of what had been banalized liturgy, as Benedict referred to it. What happened then when the traditional Latin Mass was abrogated? You see this massive falling off from the faith. You see this massive closing of all the churches. You see Pope Benedict himself talking about seminaries closing, monasteries closing, and the liturgy becoming banalized.
This council created many calamities, so many problems, so much misery in reality. Seminaries closed, convents closed, the liturgy was banalized. And the true.
So look at the power of the new Mass to cause people to move away from the faith, and then say, well, what will be the opposite of that? Oh, it's the traditional Latin Mass, which when it was introduced, every single time that it was,
and when it was freed.
Yeah, when it was freed, most dramatically by Summorum Pontificum, you see this massive return to the traditional faith, the doctrinal integrity of the traditional faith, as is evidenced by a guy, once again, like Harrison Butker, these other men that we mentioned, Michael Knowles, Matt Walsh, all these people in pretty influential position in the States. who encountered it, realize that's the real thing, that's what they want for themselves and their children, and become traditional Catholics. What's it?
It does it to prelates too, because Cardinal Burke was influenced by it.
Oh, absolutely. Cardinal Burke said during his sermon, he said, we can't forget that there are a number of people, he's talking about himself, for whom, as young people, when they were exposed to traditional Latin Mass, it was the traditional Latin Mass that gave them the grace and the Catholicity to hear their own vocation to the priesthood.
Those of us who are old enough to have grown up worshiping God according to the Usus Antiqua cannot help but consider how it inspired us to keep our gaze fixed upon Jesus, especially in responding to our vocation in life.
So you see this constant, on the part of the modernists, this constant chipping away at the Latin Mass because it was so powerful, it was so strong, it took a long time. So you have the Mass of 1962, I think they call that the John the 23rd Mass, where there was some, like the introduction of St. Joseph to the canon or whatever, just little tiny things that seem so harmless. And then you have the 1965 Mass, which is like a hybrid, some sort of a reform type Mass. And then of course 1969, they just come out with a new Mass, a Novus Ordo, and they say, oh, the old one was abrogated, which Benedict later said, that's not true, it was never abrogated. So they first watered it down. All the way through the 20th century, they were watering it down. And then in 1969, they just used raw power, raw obedience. You must obey. You will now go to the new Mass whether you like it or not, and the old one is abrogated. This is the extent to which modernists feel that the traditional Latin Mass, lex orandi, lex credendi, if they pray like that, they're going to believe like that. And we will get nowhere with our brotherhood of man and our great ecumenical enterprise.
What do you mean when you say that the Latin Mass informs and influences other forms of worship?
Well, that's always been part of my polemic because I'm always kind of concerned that people who are either new to tradition or they're just looking on, they realize there's something wrong in the church and they're looking on. And to interrupt myself, there are so many thousands, tens of thousands of really good priests in the church. I work in the church today. Who may not be offering the Latin Mass yet, but many of them are disposed to it, they're interested in it, they come to our conferences, they want to have conversations. And I'm always really eager to let people know that we're not at all trying to push that away. Those people are all coming in the same direction as we are. We're all trying to figure this thing out together in the middle of a revolution. All those priests, I always say, fathers, hang in there, you're tradition-minded, and that's an ally for me. We're all working, figuring this out. So when I say that, the traditional Latin Mass is important for everyone, not just those who happen to understand it or who attend it or who are able to, because let's face it, a lot of people just don't have it. This is still an incredibly relevant, this event is relevant to them. The traditional Latin Mass is relevant to them because why? Because it informs authentic Catholicism, it informs all liturgy, it informs the new Mass. This is something that Pope Benedict XVI was very clear about. He said there's he called it mutual enrichment. And that was controversial because I don't believe the traditional Mass is enriched by the new Mass. But I'll take his point that the traditional Mass, the existence of the traditional Mass in the church, in a diocese, will enrich the new Mass. And that's incredibly important. You have this example in the center of this is what Francis was worried about. That's why he went after diocesan priests in the diocesan masses. If you have that set up in any diocese or in every diocese or in many dioceses, now everybody has an example. They have the ultimate high watermark. Like, okay, this is where Catholic liturgy used to be. This is what it looked like. This is how priests used to dress in cassocks, and this is the old catechism. You have that example for people who, in the middle of a revolution, to sort of orient themselves. Sister Lucia talked about diabolical disorientation. We're all diabolically disoriented to a degree. The traditional Latin Mass helps everybody, not just traditionalists, but everyone kind of go orient back to what the Mass is all about, what the faith is all about, what we're on this earth for, why we're here in the first place. So I would say I would agree with Benedict, even though Benedict was not a traditionalist. I would agree that just freeing the Latin Mass is good, not just for traditionalists, but for everyone, because it will help every priest in the world see what authentic traditional liturgy looks like and try to move in that direction, which is what we all want.
Does it even depend on their personal holiness?
That's the beauty of it. It does not. And that's another point because that I think we really need to make. I grew up Catholic family, going to Catholic school, and I remember being surprised when I was a kid. One sister would tell us that the personal holiness of the priest, it's not everything dependent on the personal holiness of the priest. Some pretty, lax guys have been priests in the history.
They can even be in mortal sin.
They can be in mortal sin and still say still say the Mass, under the condition that they go to confession right afterwards. But in other words, the holiness of the priest doesn't matter. I mean, isn't key to this, isn't dependent on his holiness, and his personality is not dependent. So that's why, for example, you see that the priest at the altar of the Latin Mass literally turn around. It doesn't have everything to do with him. He's simply leading us as a consecrated priest. He consecrates the bread and wine, and this is the worship, the proper worship that we need to give to Almighty God. The Latin Mass is greater than the priests who say it, and that's really important. The greatest sermon ever preached, the most powerful catechism in the world. And so this would be something, talk about our strategy from the conclave moving forward to now. We're not looking for the Pope to come and sort of become a traditionalist and then everything's going to be fine. If the Pope, even if a Pope is diabolically disoriented, if the Pope will have enough pastoral solicitude to free this Mass, we know what happens. The children of light will do the rest, just as we did after the Indult and after Summorum Pontificum itself. The Latin Mass is the thing that built holy, mighty Christendom, and not because of the holy priests, right? It's the Mass that matters. Never was it said, it's the priests that matter, right? No, it's the Mass that matter. This is the beautiful thing about authentic liturgy. It's not dependent on the personal holiness or on the personality of the priest, right? And so again, as I say with the Pope, it's not dependent on a Pope being a traditionalist before we will support this. Pope Benedict was not a traditionalist, and yet he liberated the Mass, and so all of a sudden you have this explosion of the traditional Catholic faith. You destroy the traditional Mass, and the reign of Antichrist is upon us. It's as simple as that. You restore the traditional Mass, and you're well on your way to restoring what? To restoring all things in Jesus Christ, and that's the point.
So do you think this has any ramifications politically?
Well, of course. The thing that stands between us and the New World Order is the traditional Latin Mass movement. Yeah. Because this is the Mass that was given to us by our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. He instituted this Mass. He instituted the priesthood, right? And he did so that we can survive whatever happens in the world, whatever the devil serves up, if we stay dedicated and faithful to the faith of our fathers, which the touchstone of which is the Latin Mass, then we will be able to, please God, withstand whatever comes. So the New World Order is the most diabolical anti-Christian movement possibly in history. And so you can see with the globalism and everything that's going on, the globalists are incredibly interested in what? In co-opting this town. The globalists cannot bring about their New World Order without a pope on their side, whether he's intentionally on their side or deluded, diabolically disoriented to serve their ends, which is what obviously we're all concerned about right now. But in any case, when you saw the push that they made to recruit Francis, I'm talking about Gates and Schwab and the whole World Economic Forum, Davos, get Francis in there, get Cardinal Turkson in there, right? To bless this diabolical New World Order. They know how important it is, and so they made every effort to do that. So I would say one of the reasons that the Great Reset, for example, at least has stumbled, we don't know if it's over, but one of the reasons it stumbled is because what was their number one weapon? It was COVID. COVID was their weapon. That's how Charles and Klaus Schwab and Gates and everybody else was going to, Biden, they were all going to lock down the world with COVID. Who broke from COVID most dramatically in public forum? Who was it? First, traditional Catholics. They said no, the Mass and Sacraments, that's essential. Porn shops and liquor stores, not so essential. The Mass and the Sacrament, the church is absolutely essential. So you had priests, as I've said so many times, go into the parking lot. In our case, we got a truck. The priest said Mass from the truck. Why? Because he wasn't about to let the globalist agenda crush the Mass, the traditional Latin Mass. Now that, in my opinion, could be, and sometimes we take heat from this, but it could be, this is where Francis felt embarrassment, because he had promised he was going to hand the Catholic Church over to their agenda. He was the first one. He stood right out here in the piazza. It was empty in dramatic fashion. He's out there. He masked himself up. He promoted the vaccines. And here are the traditional Catholics saying, not on your life. And after a while of COVID, that became the big story. The people who are resisting, there were Protestants that did it as well. Finally, there were some great, brave doctors. But the ones who really got out there as far as Francis is concerned were the traditional Latin Mass Catholics. And that was a problem. Why? Because we are not beholden to a New World Order. We're not beholden to a global government that's going to be the nanny state for us all. Just as similarly with synodality, we don't really need the church to listen to us on any other issue other than give us back the Mass of our fathers. That's it. And so we're not really playing that game, and they know it. And so they had to do something to break us up, to break these clans up, to undermine that automatic counter-revolution, which wasn't even thought through to any greater extent than we simply want to be faithful Catholics and we want to go to the Latin Mass. So yeah, I think the Latin Mass movement is hugely impactful on politics and poses a direct threat to the New World Order. For them, it must be frustrating because that Mass makes us not so much, we're confirmed soldiers of Jesus Christ. We have to die rather than deny the faith of our fathers, which means deny the Mass of our fathers, because it's the touchstone. So at our confirmation, we promised to die rather than deny or an article of our faith, including the Latin Mass. But the thing is, which makes us a very slippery opponent for them, it's not so important. If you are faithful to the faith, if you're faithful to the traditional Latin Mass, if you understand why you're going to that Mass and what it all means, it's not that you're transformed into a crusader necessarily, although sometimes in the past that's happened. What it does is it transforms you into a saint. That's the idea. Sanctity is at the end of it, fully understanding and practicing your faith, with the touchstone of which is the Latin Mass. And that's the big threat to the revolution. It's been the threat all along, that people will be so faithful to Catholicism, to the Church, to the faith that was handed down to us from the apostles, instituted by Jesus Christ to give grace, the sacraments, so faithful to that they would become saints. And sanctity, and that's why screaming and shouting and yelling may feel good, but a much more effective counter-revolutionary measure is, as I say, take a stand by getting on your knees at the Latin Mass. It's a very, very effective counter-revolutionary measure. And I think for many of these modernists, that's the biggest threat in the world today, is that there will be millions of us with our children on our knees at the traditional Latin Mass. That is counter-revolution.